future.
Good day everyone, I'm Bonsard of Radio Retro Future, here with another video on Artico and Art Nouveau, that despite we being a channel on steampunk, these videos on these art styles are now some of our most popular videos, so I've been considering doing more of types of videos for a long time. However, as we're now doing a contest with these themes, I thought it would be interesting to elaborate on the use of Art Deco in fiction and world building. But before that, we still have one more week on our current Kickstarter Journey to Elysium, in which we intend to include a lot of Art Nouveau inspired designs for the upcoming issues. Go check that out. But before I go on, I'm going to assume you already watched my videos on these art styles, so I'm not going to rehash all that information here. Instead, I'll talk about how these decorative arts affected pop culture and how these can be used to build up a credible setting. Before the name Art Deco was even invented by the 1950s, the aesthetic had already established itself well in science fiction. Metropolis in particular comes to mind. It is probably one of the most influential science fiction movies of all time and has influenced global pop culture in both Hollywood and Japanese animation ever since. We associate these early German films with expressionism. You need to keep this in mind whenever we use architecture in a scene. Before the Expressionists, movie sets were arranged like stage plays. The props were there to immerse the viewer, but they were props nonetheless. Passive features on the stage that actors would interact with and, well, little else. In Expressionism, however, the environment had to play an active role in any scene. They had to grab the viewer's attention and immerse them in the world without the actors being present, and still move the story onward. One of the most famous examples of this is probably the opening scene of Blade Runner. This happens to be a feature of noir, who have been using the techniques of the Expressionists to create vibrant, oppressive environments, in particular by using lights and shadows. Another take on this is Batman the Animated Series, where characters are often being stalked by shadows, not that dissimilar from another Expressionist classic, Nosferatu. I need to make a video on the Expressionists and the Noir at some point, but I hope this will do for now. For another example, I want to mention the Strange Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Although it does use shadows, here it is the environment itself that steals the show. The backgrounds are weird, alien and disorienting, the proportions do not match the actors, and it is all very deliberate to reflect the mental state of the character telling the story. In Citizen Kane, we see similar uses of furniture and rooms to symbolize the main character's inner turmoil and growing ego. And then, of course, Metropolis. There we have the upper city that's luminous, futuristic, with an intricate network of roads connecting the various levels. Its buildings are also sleek, futuristic and efficient. The architect's tower, who designed the whole city, is right in the middle, like a spider in his web, is weaving an ever-growing and increasingly complex city. However, this splendid technocratic utopia has a mirror. The lower city, where the workers live in a dark, claustrophobic and almost medieval underground. The only thing futuristic here is the massive machines that the workers have to frantically tend to, otherwise these machines will punish them like the God of the Old Testament. This darkness tends to be in stark contrast to the light that is the character of Maria, the story's heroine, where the protagonist Frieder falls in love with. As the main character Frieder is torn by his conscience over the contradictions in his father's city, he visits a cathedral, a place from the past that should have no value in the present, but here it is, where he receives a revelation from his ancestors as they are literally speaking through him through their art when he is having a fever dream. All the characters are constantly being confronted and oppressed by the environment. Their behavior is shaped literally by their surroundings, so humans become one with the machinery that dictate their lives. In the latter half of the film, Maria engages the environment in a biblical battle as the workers neglected their machines for too long, and now their city and their children are drowning. But what does this have to do with Art Deco? First, the term Art Deco was conceived 30 years after Metropolis. Until then, Art Deco just referred to the decorative arts coming from France. These styles became very popular in the roaring 20s of the United States, combined with another craze: Egyptology. Flapper girls would dress like Mesopotamian princesses, and the elite would throw Egyptian-themed parties, and so on. It might not be apparent, but if you look at the insides of ornate skyscrapers from the 1910s to 1930s, there are a lot of references to lost civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, but also Mesoamerican cultures. Let's contrast this to some fictional settings famous for the use of Art Deco, like BioShock, and in particular the city of Rapture. Unlike its historical counterparts, Rapture's architecture has little references to history, only commerce and Andrew Ryan's own ideology. The first thing you see is this banner with Ryan looming over you. No gods or kings, only men. It doesn't just reject central authority, but also the past. It's a kind of a shame then that they make all these references to ancient mythology and location names like Poseidon Plaza, Neptune's Bounty, Point Prometheus. You know, gods. Now let's have a look at the spiritual successor of BioShock, Atomic Heart. It's the Soviet take on the BioShock story. Interestingly enough, in the opening segment, Atomic Heart does have a lot of references to past Soviet achievements. Their space mission, the Patriotic War, and of course the Soviet leaders of the past. But then it kinda does this shift where the monuments refer to the future. The present is treated as this transitional period from the glorious past into the utopian future. Yes, there are all these robots doing menial things, but there are more of a sideshow in comparison to all the statements being made through all the monuments around in the environment. Everything emphasizes this is a future in the making, and the present is a fleeting thing. Both BioShock and Atomic Heart settings have this context that everything isn't as great as they appear to be. But it's an interesting juxtaposition that BioShock's Rapture focuses on the present through consumerism, while Atomic Heart setting is in this weird in-between era where people are being distracted from the present with dedications to the past and future. But again, what does this have to do with Art Deco, right? Okay. In many ways, architects think like expressionists. It's all about how humans interact with their environment, where they like to sleep, cook, watch television, and so on. Also, how people react. Where do people look once they enter a reception area or a big room? This is something you see a lot in Art Deco architecture. Lines that direct your eyes into particular directions. Murals at strange angles that suddenly grab your attention when you least expect it. Big spaces opening up after you leave confined spaces, and so on. Check out some architects' channel and listen to their design philosophy. It's truly fascinating. What popularized the decorative styles of the United States is the self-image of industrialists and entrepreneurs. Many of them were immigrants of humble beginnings. To them, therefore, 1920s America was like a Valhalla, and they wanted their skyscrapers to resemble that. Similar to how Ryan wanted Rapture to resemble his objectivist ideology. These buildings were to look imposing, sleek, modern, and luxurious as they dominated the skyline, but not pompous like the palaces from the ancient regime or cathedral, but a building for the future. Like I said, ancient Egypt was trending at the time, and the pharaohs had these imposing angular buildings with these majestic Atlantic statues showing off their prestige. And these complexes looked impressive even after 6,000 years. And it is what the entrepreneurs were going for, a timeless, imposing style of architecture that transcended the era itself. And yet these buildings reflected the age of science and industry, reflected literally. They didn't use tacky paints, but reflective surfaces of glass, polished marble, and metallics that modern industry could produce. To contrast these with the smooth, glossy surfaces, they used velvet and leathers on the furnishings and floors. Yes, the decorative art didn't stop with the building's exterior and interior, but also included custom-made furniture. These walls couldn't be decorated with wallpaper and portraits, as was the norm of the 19th century. They had wall reliefs like the palaces of the ancients. These buildings were constructed to be monuments that not only reflected the present, but also the past and future. But it wouldn't last. In 1930, the Great Depression sank in, and building Art Deco was now considered to be in bad taste. Also in the 1930s, the Germans came to the States, and they didn't like the French and their ornate decorations. They liked reason and science. This is Raymond Loewy, the father of industrial design. You may not know his name, but you know his work. Like the Coca-Cola bottle, to name but one pop icon he helped create. And he hated redundancies. When asked if there was anything he could not improve on, Loewy said it was the egg, as it complemented its form and function perfectly. Through this philosophy, Streamline Modern came about and its consumer-oriented derivative, Populux. As the name implies, it's all about movement and efficiency. Therefore, it looks like a dressed-down Art Deco, because, well, it kind of is. Out were the angular shapes, and in came the rounded surfaces. It's far more scientific, futuristic, and efficient. Not only did a lot of vehicles take on these shapes, vehicles also became an inspiration for this type of architecture. Yeah, that's a thing. But for more on that, I recommend you watch our previous video. But what does this all mean for world building? Well, let's go one style at a time. But first, I need to emphasize that I write speculative steampunk, thus I attempt to figure out how in my setting such architectural styles could come about. And as I said, architecture reflects their respective societies, so a style like Art Deco would likely be prevalent in societies or cultures that have a high self-esteem. People who are proud of their past and strive to create monuments for prosperity. That said, it could also be a style applied by overachievers, groups, states, or people who have something to prove. This image from the 1937 Paris World Fair springs to mind, where the Russians and German pavilions right opposing each other, and both of them are trying to out-prestige the other. It's just too funny. I'm not saying this is typical of Art Deco, I'm just saying that this is a style that could appeal to such regimes. To illustrate, this is a neoclassical design from the 1930s for the Palace of the Soviets, a 260-meter monument to Stalin, making it taller than the Eiffel Tower. But when the plans were announced, it was universally ridiculed. But in 1939, the Soviets started construction anyway, only to be cancelled in 1941 due to the German invasion. Streamline Modern, on the other hand, is all about progress, efficiency, and speed. History might be an afterthought, if not outright dismissed by such societies. It's no coincidence that 1950s sci-fi all resemble Streamline Modern to some extent, like in the Jetsons, because this is how they envisioned the future. Thus, Streamline became very prominent in sci-fi design for the next 40 years or so. But what about Art Nouveau as envisioned by Musha Guillaume? Well, as I stated in my original video, it was a very artist-driven movement that derived ideas from nature, the Orient, and the Far East. Features of the style included asymmetrical arches, grotto-like hallways, and colored glass shaped in floral designs. Even though it found its way into commerce through storefront designs and posters, its movement didn't survive the malaise of the First World War. It was continued in pockets of artistic spaces, and Jugendstil and the famous Tiffany lamps. Interest had waned significantly. However, under the influence of a new emerging music scene in the 1960s and 70s, Art Nouveau started reappearing on music posters and LPs, and till today there are still artists making new art in the style, like Alex Alice, who I had the honor of interviewing on my show. But that is for the illustration style. What about the architecture? Well, it's hard to say, as the movement is such an anomaly. Suffice to say, it came into existence in a relatively prosperous age in which the economy was prosperous. Although it made its way into public structures like the Paris metro system, it was too frivolous. A high culture eccentricity that lacked authority and the austerity that the interbellum era demanded. Even if Art Nouveau architecture would be in vogue in a fictional setting, it would be enjoyed by members of the higher classes, and likely a very select group of that. Therefore, it would be more a thing related to a character than a society at large. That said, in movies and games, it is sometimes used in an expressionistic way for creepy settings similar to the sets of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Especially fences and gateways are often in this floristic style to create dark, gothic, and dreamlike environments. Due to their organic curves and asymmetrical design, with the proper lighting, these ornaments can give the impression that the environment is alive. As for games, Sunken City, due to all the reefs overgrowing the buildings, this strange city has a bit of an Art Nouveau feel to it. As a matter of fact, it's what we're going for in our current comic Journey to Elysium that is still, for the last week, on Kickstarter. So go check that out. Post-production Bonsard here. Always wanted to say that. Anyway, we have now finally revealed our final alternative cover variant D, which is actually an expressionist poster. So go check that out. And if you have a hard time picking your favorite cover, we now have postcards, a whole set with all the variant covers and an additional poster one. So go check that out. We have included all types of new add-ons for this last week. You can get my autograph on a postcard. You can now get the bookends that people love that were on the last Kickstarter. We've got postcards. We've got STL files so you can 3D print your own characters. And also don't forget we now have our new book, Enwin, is there only temporarily. So go get it today. Back to the show. And with that said, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you learned something from this. And I hope you're interested in partaking in our current contest or those we are doing in the future. And with that, I'm gonna bid you adieu. And as always, make things your way. Good night.